My name is Claire Miller. 27. Junior accountant. I bought my condo in Logan Square at 26, paid for with 11 years of midnight shifts and tips I counted to the last quarter. My father Arthur came first. Said he was checking the plumbing. I thought, maybe this time, he would just say he was proud. One sentence. That was all I wanted. His eyes went to the espresso machine. Then the bookshelf. Then the second monitor on my desk. The eyes of a man who is adding things up. You've done well for yourself, Claire. Better than we ever did. Not pride. Inventory. Calculating what was here, and whether any of it could be his. His eyes drifted toward my open laptop, the banking app still on the screen. I reached over and closed it. A week later, my mother Diane arrived. Behind her, my sister Sloane 24, between jobs, between plans, between everything. 4 suitcases. No warning. Sloane needs your second bedroom. Just until she gets back on her feet. Mom, I didn't agree to this. This is my home. We gave you a roof for 20 years, Claire. Don't be ungrateful. I wanted to say this roof is mine. I paid for it. My name is on the deed. Instead, I watched them move through my apartment like it already belonged to them. They had already gone through my mail, copied my bank documents, and filed a lawsuit without a word to me. 2 days later, a process server walked into my firm. My managing partner watching through the glass. Parental investment reimbursement, $150,000. Or 40% of my condo. Bank account frozen. 4 o'clock that afternoon. I came home. Sloane's bags filled the hallway. My space. Without my consent. Sloane was out that night. I was the only one left in it. Was I ever their daughter? I asked the empty space around me. Or just a savings account they decided to cash out? Before we go any further, please hit subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. If you give this a like, good luck is coming your way. That night I drove to my storage unit. 2 in the morning, 11 years of pay stubs, cancelled checks, every single one. They sued an accountant. That was their first mistake. The cold came early to Logan Square that year. It arrived without ceremony, the way most unwelcome things do, slipping under windowsills, rattling the old frames of the building on Kedzie Avenue. Turning the gap beneath the front door into a whistle that no amount of draft tape could fully silence. By the first week of November, the Chicago wind had already made its intentions clear. It wasn't interested in being polite about it. Claire Miller sat at her kitchen table at 7:15 on a Saturday morning. Both hands wrapped around a ceramic mug she'd bought at the thrift store on Milwaukee Avenue 3 years ago for 75 cents. The mug said "World's Okayest Fisherman" in faded blue letters. Which had nothing to do with her life, but she'd bought it anyway because it was sturdy and the handle didn't wobble. She appreciated things that didn't wobble. The 401k statement lay flat on the table in front of her, still in its opened envelope. She'd read it twice already, but she read it again not because she'd forgotten the numbers, but because she wanted to feel them settle into her chest like something real. The balance was modest. She knew that. She wasn't naive about where she stood compared to the colleagues at her firm. Who'd started with help, who'd had their first deposits made by parents who understood compound interest as a gift rather than a concept. But it was hers. Every dollar in that statement had passed through her hands first. Every dollar knew what she'd traded for it. She set the mug down and reached for the mortgage deed, which she kept in a manila folder inside the second drawer of her kitchen desk, the desk. She'd assembled herself from a flat pack box at 2 in the morning after a 12-hour shift. Using a butter knife as a screwdriver because she couldn't find the Allen wrench. The deed was cool to the touch, the paper heavier than regular paper, the kind of paper that understood its own significance. She ran her index finger along the edge of it slowly, the way you'd trace the spine of a book you'd been waiting years to read. 700 square feet, 1 bedroom. A second room she used as an office, which was barely large enough for a desk and a filing cabinet. But which she'd furnished with the specific, deliberate care of someone who understands that small spaces can either feel like cells or sanctuaries, depending entirely on who holds the key. She held the key. She'd held it for 14 months, and in those 14 months, she had replaced the bathroom faucet herself, repainted the kitchen wall from a dingy rental beige to a soft white. She'd chosen from a strip of paint chips, and installed a dimmer switch in the living room because she liked the ability to control the light. She liked the ability to control things, in general. Outside, the November wind pushed against the windows again, and the radiator in the corner answered with a hiss and a knock, its own percussive language. The sound of old pipes doing their reluctant best. Claire had learned its rhythms. 2 knocks meant it was waking up. 1 long hiss meant it had found its pace. She'd stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing the sound of your own breathing. She had just refilled her mug from the espresso machine on the counter. A refurbished Breville she'd bought from a coworker who was upgrading, paid for in cash when the buzzer rang. She wasn't expecting anyone. The intercom screen in the hallway showed her father's face, slightly fish-eyed by the wide-angle lens. His collar turned up against the cold, his breath visible in small white clouds. He was smiling the way he always smiled at cameras, with his mouth, not his eyes. She pressed the door release. Arthur Miller was 58 years old and had the particular bearing of a man who had once been in charge of something, and had never fully accepted that the something was gone. He'd managed the stockroom and then the floor staff of a mid-size sporting goods retailer for 11 years. And when that retailer had shuttered its Chicago locations in 2019, something in his posture had shifted, not collapsed, exactly, but tilted, the way a building looks after one of its foundational supports has been quietly removed. He filled doorways when he entered them. He looked at rooms before he looked at people. He looked at her espresso machine before he looked at her. Came to check the plumbing, he said, stepping inside and pulling his coat off in a single practiced motion, hanging it on the hook by the door as though the hook had been installed for that purpose. Your mother said you mentioned the bathroom faucet was dripping again. Claire had mentioned no such thing, but she said nothing. You've done well for yourself, Claire. He turned slowly in the kitchen doorway, his gaze moving across the countertops. The new shelf brackets she'd installed above the sink, the small framed print above the coffee station. Better than we ever did. There was no warmth in it. She heard that immediately, not as a conscious analysis, but as a physical sensation, the way you register cold air before your brain has named the temperature. The words had the shape of a compliment and the texture of something else entirely. Something that was taking inventory. I told myself I was being paranoid. She watched him move toward the short hallway that led to the bathroom, his footsteps deliberate on the hardwood, pausing for just a moment at the entrance to the small office room. The filing cabinet, the second monitor. He didn't stop, but the pause was there. In the bathroom, the faucet was not dripping. She heard him run the water anyway, heard the particular sound of a man who has entered a space under a stated purpose and must now perform it convincingly. The water ran for about 45 seconds. Then the pipes groaned and it stopped. He came back to the kitchen and settled into the chair across from hers with the ease of a man who has decided he belongs wherever he sits. That machine new? He nodded toward the espresso maker. Refurbished, she said. Bought it secondhand. Still. He let the words sit there. Still. She reached across the table and pulled her laptop toward her, angling it slightly, a small, unconscious gesture, the kind of adjustment you make when someone is standing too close on the train. She didn't close it entirely, but she changed the angle. His eyes followed the movement. Thanks, Dad, she said, her voice coming out more carefully measured than she'd intended. I worked a lot of overtime for this. I know you did. He folded his hands on the table, and for a moment his face was unreadable. Then, you always were the one who knew how to make things happen. He said it the way a person says something that is technically true but means something adjacent to true. Something in the same neighborhood but a different house. The radiator hissed in the corner, that long, steady sound that meant it had found its rhythm. He stayed for another 20 minutes, made a brief and unconvincing inspection of the bathroom. P-trap, accepted a cup of coffee, and left with the same half-smile he'd arrived with. Claire watched him from the window as he walked to his car. A 2017 Nissan Sentra with a dented rear quarter panel, and sat in it for a long moment without starting the engine. Just sitting. The angle of the car meant she couldn't see his face. She turned away from the window. The mortgage deed was still on the table where she'd left it. She folded it back into the manila folder and returned it to the drawer and stood in the kitchen for a moment in the silence that her father had left behind him. which felt different from the silence that had been there before he arrived. At 27, I finally felt the ground beneath my feet. The problem was, I couldn't stop checking to see if it was cracking. She picked up her mug. The espresso had gone lukewarm. Outside, the wind found a new angle against the glass, and the radiator responded with its familiar, faithful knock. She told herself she was being paranoid. She did not entirely believe herself. The following Saturday arrived gray and flat, the sky. The color of old dishwater, the kind of Chicago November day that made you want to stay inside and keep the lights on. Claire had been up since 5:30. She had a system for Saturday's laundry in by 6, coffee by 6:15, the weeks. Receipts entered into her personal ledger by 7, groceries ordered for pickup by 8. It was a system she built not out of compulsive rigidity, but out of the earned understanding that when you have exactly enough, and not a dollar more than exactly enough, structure is not a personality trait. It is a survival mechanism. She was on her second load of laundry, the dryer running in the closet off the hallway. The apartment smelling of warm cotton and the faint pine of her cleaning spray, when the buzzer rang. She checked the intercom screen. Her mother, and behind her mother, her sister. And beside her sister, arranged with the practiced efficiency of people who had thought this through in advance, 4 oversized suitcases. 2 rolling duffels, a garment bag draped over Sloane's forearm like a defeated flag. Claire pressed the intercom button. "Mom, I didn't know you were coming. Buzz us up, Claire, it's freezing out here." Sloane's ears are practically blue. Sloane, who was 24 and had never had blue ears in her life, made a face at the camera that was not quite a smile and not quite an apology and was entirely neither. Claire pressed the release. Diane Miller was 55 and had the particular energy of a woman who had decided, sometime in her early 40s, that the world owed her a debt it was perpetually failing to pay. She was not unkind in the conventional sense. She didn't raise her voice, didn't slam doors, didn't issue direct ultimatums. Her method was softer and, Claire had come to understand, considerably more effective. She operated through the grammar of obligation, through the careful placement of the words family and sacrifice and ungrateful in sentences that had the structure of observation but the function of instruction. She came through the door first, Sloane behind her with the garment bag, the suitcases following in 2 trips that involved a great deal of noise in the hallway. "Sloane needs a reset, Claire." Diane set her purse on the kitchen counter, Claire's kitchen counter, with the easy authority of a woman entering her own space. "It's only fair she stays in the second bedroom until her brand takes off." 6 weeks. Maybe 8. We thought the new year would be a good stopping point. "Her brand," Claire repeated. "The influencer thing. You know, she's been building her following. She just needs a base of operations that isn't your father's basement." Sloane had already moved past Claire into the hallway, had already pushed open the door to the office room, was already standing in the middle of it with her hand on one hip, evaluating it with the calm authority of a hotel guest assessing an unsatisfactory room. "It's small," Sloane said. "It's an office," Claire said. "I didn't agree to this, Mom." Claire turned back to Diane, and she heard her own voice and recognized the tremor in it, not from weakness exactly, but from the specific exertion of a person trying to sound firm while every domestic instinct trained into her since childhood was pushing in the opposite direction. She gripped her apartment keys in her right hand, the metal edges pressing into her palm. "This is my space. I have a system here." She felt the familiar weight of the sentence before her mother said it, the way you feel a drop in barometric pressure before rain. The air pressure changing around a phrase you've heard in different forms your entire life. "We gave you a roof for 20 years, Claire." Diane pulled her coat off and laid it across the back of the sofa, smoothing it with 2 practiced strokes. "Don't be ungrateful." I wondered if my no even had a sound in this family. The suitcases made 4 distinct thumps against the hardwood as Sloane dragged them into the hallway. The dryer was still running in the closet, its low hum suddenly inaudible beneath the new noise of occupation. The smell of Sloane's perfume, something sweet and synthetic, the kind that came in a bottle shaped like a bow, was already finding its way through the apartment, overriding the pine and cotton smell that Claire had spent the morning building. She set her keys on the counter. In the kitchen, she moved to fill the kettle, because she needed something to do with her hands, and because the kettle was something she controlled. She kept her back to her mother. It was while she was standing at the sink, watching the water run, that she saw it. On the counter beside the kettle, slightly behind the fruit bowl, an envelope. Opened. She hadn't left it there. She knew she hadn't left it there, with the absolute certainty of a person who knows exactly where every piece of paper in her apartment belongs. Because every piece of paper in her apartment was there by her deliberate intention. She picked it up. It was her health insurance explanation of benefits. The monthly statement from her employer's plan. The document that, among other things, listed her coverage tier, her income-based premium bracket, her deductible, her current claims balance. It had been opened and refolded. Not neatly. Hastily, the crease was wrong, the fold not aligned with the original factory fold. She turned it over slowly. Her mother was behind her, now standing at the entrance to the kitchen. Watching Sloane argue with the filing cabinet about whether it could be moved 3 feet to the left. "Mom." Claire's voice was careful, quiet. "This was in my mail." "Oh, that?" Diane glanced at it with the studied neutrality of someone who has prepared for the question. "It was just sitting out. I set it on the counter so it wouldn't get mixed up with the coats." It had not been sitting out. Claire knew where her mail lived. It lived in the basket by the door, sorted, unopened until she chose to open it. This envelope had not been in the basket. She set it face down on the counter. I stared at the unpacked bags filling my hallway, and I felt not angry, not yet. Not quite. I felt the apartment changing shape around me. I felt the square footage contracting. "There's a coffee shop 2 blocks east," Claire said, folding a dish towel. "On Armitage. I have some work I need to finish this morning. I'll be a few hours." It wasn't true, but she needed air that she hadn't divided with anyone. She put on her coat. She picked up her laptop bag. She left her keys on the counter, her own counter, in her own apartment, and the act of leaving them behind felt, in some way. She couldn't fully articulate, like a test she was failing. She told herself it was temporary. 6 weeks, her mother had said. Maybe 8. She stood on the sidewalk outside her building in the November gray. The cold finding the gap at her collar, and she looked up at the window of the second bedroom, her office, where a light had just come on. Sloane had wasted no time. I had spent 11 years building 4 walls I could call my own. Standing on the sidewalk below them, I tried to remember when a home had stopped feeling like a refuge and started feeling like a negotiation. The wind came off the lake 3 blocks east, sharp and purposeful, and Claire pulled her collar up and walked. The Miller family Sunday brunch had been, in theory, a tradition of warmth. In practice, it had always been something else. A performance. A recurring ritual in which the seating arrangement was never random. And the conversation was never aimless, and the audience, whoever happened to be in earshot, was always, whether they understood it or not, part of the staging. Claire knew this now with a clarity she hadn't always possessed. She'd spent most of her teenage years and a good portion of her early 20s believing that the discomfort she felt at these gatherings was her own deficiency, her inability to relax, her oversensitivity. Her failure to simply enjoy the meal and the company and the benign chaos of family life. It had taken her years to understand that the discomfort wasn't a malfunction. It was a correct response to an incorrect environment. The diner on Fullerton was crowded on Sunday mornings. It always was. Chrome counter stools, laminate tables, coffee in white ceramic mugs, the smell of bacon grease and pancake batter thick in the air. The Millers had been coming here for years, back when Claire was in high school, back when brunch had still contained, if not warmth, at least the possibility of it. She arrived at 11:05. Her parents and Sloane were already seated at a corner booth, which her father always requested because a corner booth allowed him to see the room while minimizing the number of directions from which he could be approached. A man who liked his back to a wall. 3 of their parents' church friends occupied the adjacent table, which Claire understood immediately was not coincidental. Ed and Ruth Garfield, who went back 30 years with Arthur. Linda Pacheco, who had known her mother since they were both cashiers at the same grocery chain. And who had the kind of sympathetic face that invited and rewarded confession. Claire slid into the booth. Diane passed her a menu she didn't need. Sloane was on her phone, not looking up. The first 10 minutes were ordinary. Coffee ordered, pleasantries exchanged. Arthur performing the easy bonhomie of a man among familiar company. He was good at this part: the social orchestration, the broad joke, the familiar history. He was charming in the way that certain men are charming, completely, selectively, and in inverse proportion to how closely you knew them. She should have seen the turn coming. She always saw it coming in retrospect. But in the moment, it arrived the way a cold front arrives after all. The visible signs have passed without incident, and you've decided the forecast was wrong. Arthur set his coffee mug down. You know, Ruth, he said, his voice shifting into its carrying register, the one he used when he wanted to be heard at a radius beyond his immediate table. I was telling Diane just last night, retirement is going to be tighter than we planned. Social Security only goes so far. You know how it is. Ruth Garfield made a sympathetic sound. Ed nodded with the solemn acknowledgement of a man who had heard this particular category of complaint before. We did everything right. Arthur shook his head slowly. Put in the hours. Raised the kids. Did without, so they could have more. He let a pause develop, the practiced pause of a man who had learned that silence in the right place is louder than words. And here's Claire, living in a luxury condo in Logan Square. It's 700 square feet, Claire said, quietly. While her sister sleeps on a twin bed. He continued without acknowledging her interruption, his voice carrying the measured grief of a man being wronged in public. I guess we didn't teach her enough about sharing. The adjacent table had gone quiet. Linda Pacheco's hand had stilled around her coffee mug. Ruth Garfield was looking at Claire with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral and was not quite succeeding. The diner was not loud enough. Claire felt the heat rise from the base of her throat up through her jaw. That particular, specific heat that lives in the difference between anger and humiliation, that occupies the exact space where those two emotions share a wall. She felt every set of eyes that had turned toward the sound of Arthur's voice make the short transit from him to her. She felt herself become, without consent or warning, a subject. I felt like a specimen under a microscope. Pinned, examined, judged for the crime of having survived on my own terms. Dad. Her voice came out smaller than she wanted it to. Please. Not here. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has said nothing but the truth and cannot be held responsible for how the truth lands. I'm just being honest, sweetheart. You know how I am. She did. She knew exactly how he was. She reached for her water glass, her hand not entirely steady. The clinking of silverware against ceramic plates from the tables around them had a new quality, a self-conscious quality, people resuming their own conversations with slightly excessive focus. The way people do when they've witnessed something and decided not to have witnessed it. She was looking at the table, working to compose her face, when the movement at the edge of her vision made her glance up. Her mother, reaching into her purse. A manila folder, the kind with a metal brad fastener, moving quickly from the table into the purse in a single practiced motion. But not quickly enough. Claire caught the corner of it. The blue and white logo in the lower left corner of the folder's front face. Her bank. She kept her eyes moving, tracked back to her water glass, gave nothing away. The folder was gone in under 2 seconds. I wasn't meant to see it. But I had seen it. And I am an accountant. I catalog things. I hold figures in my memory the way other people hold grudges. She thought about the EOB on her kitchen counter. The wrong fold. The too casual placement. She thought about her father's eyes on her laptop screen the previous Saturday. She thought about the specific way her mother had said 6 weeks. Maybe 8, the practiced looseness of someone who already knows the answer and is choosing not to give it yet. The waiter arrived with their food. Arthur thanked him with the expansive warmth of a man who was, in all visible ways, simply having a pleasant Sunday brunch with his family and some old friends. Claire ate her eggs. She kept her face arranged. She contributed 3 sentences to the conversation around her and asked after Ed Garfield's knee surgery and divided the bill by 4 when it came. She didn't say another word about the folder. She walked to her car alone, the November wind coming at her sideways off the lake. And she sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine for a full 2 minutes. The clinking of silverware had sounded like a jury's gavel. I sat in the cold car and I thought, they are building a case. Whatever that folder contained, they are building a case. She started the engine. The heat came on, slow and reluctant. She drove home to her apartment, which no longer entirely smelled like hers, and she sat at her kitchen table and opened her laptop and stared at a spreadsheet. She could not bring herself to work on, and the radiator knocked twice in the corner, which meant it was waking up. She was beginning to understand that she needed to do the same. Tuesday arrived with the particular cold clarity of a day that has decided to be significant. Claire had been at her desk at Hartwell & Crane's since 7:45. The accounting firm occupied the 9th floor of a building on North Wacker, and in November, the floor-to-ceiling windows on the east side produced a specific quality of morning light, bright and direct and completely without warmth. Like the overhead fluorescence in a room where something serious is about to happen. She had a performance review scheduled for Thursday. She had 3 client reconciliations due by end of week. She had, in the quiet of her commute that morning, allowed herself to believe, briefly, that the week might simply be a week. A series of tasks to complete, a series of numbers to resolve, a series of hours that would pass without incident. She was reviewing a cost-basis analysis when Janet from the front desk appeared at the entrance to the bullpen. Janet had the expression of someone delivering news they would prefer not to deliver. "Claire, there's a process server in reception." The bullpen had 12 desks. 11 of them contained people who were, in that moment, pretending very hard not to have heard what Janet had just said. The ambient noise of keyboards and quiet phone calls and the distant hum of the printer continued with slightly excessive normalcy. "Thank you, Janet," Claire said. She saved her work. She stood up. She was aware, with extraordinary precision, of the posture of every person in her peripheral vision. And she walked to reception with her face arranged and her shoulders level and her hands loose at her sides. The process server was a young man in a fleece vest who looked like he would rather be anywhere else. He confirmed her name. He handed her a sealed envelope. He said, "You've been served," with the apologetic efficiency of someone reading from a script they find distasteful. He left. She stood in the reception area for a moment. Through the glass wall to her right, she could see David Hartwell, her managing partner, at his desk. His reading glasses on, his attention apparently fixed on something on his monitor. His attention was not, she knew with absolute certainty, fixed on anything on his monitor. He had seen. She returned to her desk. She sat down. She opened the envelope under the desk, below the sightline of the bullpen, and she read. The words did what words of that kind do, they rearranged everything. Parental investment reimbursement. A legal theory she had never heard stated so nakedly. 40% equity in the condo, or $150,000 in backdated room and board from the period of her residence in her parents' home between the ages of 16 and 22. The filing date. 2 days ago. She recognized the law firm. It was not an expensive firm, but it was not a frivolous one either. Someone had paid a retainer. Someone had paid for a consultation, and then a follow-up, and then a filing. Her father had been unemployed for 3 years. Her mother worked 12 hours a week at a dry cleaner. Someone had used money they did not have to pursue, money they did not earn. She folded the papers back into the envelope. She finished the workday. She said goodbye to no one in particular. She took the elevator down and walked to her car and drove home on the Kennedy through traffic that moved at the pace of a long argument. The apartment was quiet when she arrived. Sloane was out, she could tell by the absence of the particular energy her sister generated when present, the ambient sound of video content, the light under the office door, the faint chemical sweetness of the perfume. The apartment was empty, but it did not feel like hers. Sloane's coat was on the rack by the door. Sloane's shoes were in the hallway. Sloane's presence was resident in the space the way cigarette smoke persists in upholstery in the absence of the source. Claire sat down on the living room floor. Not on the sofa. On the floor, with her back against the couch, because the floor was cold and unambiguous and she needed something unambiguous. She looked at her phone. The banking app notification she'd missed during the commute had arrived at 4:47 p.m. Account activity alert. Temporary hold applied pending legal inquiry. Affected account checking primary. She opened the app, confirmed what the notification had told her. The freeze was partial, not total, but the portion it had suspended included her automatic payment schedule. She looked at her calendar. Homeowner's insurance was due in 11 days. My life felt like a ledger where every love was actually a loan I never agreed to sign. She sat with the summons and complaint in her lap and she looked at her room. With its carefully chosen furniture and its deliberate paint color and its dimmer switch that she had wired herself, and she felt the particular, devastating quality of a specific kind of grief. Not the grief of losing something you never had. The grief of losing something you built with your own hands and believed, wrongly, was protected by the fact that you built it. Was I ever a daughter to them? She said it to the empty apartment, to no one, to the stacked legal papers. And the frozen account and the absent sister and the shadows the street lamp was casting through the Venetian blinds. Or just a long-term savings account they decided it was time to cash out? The street lamp outside was doing something, a slow, irregular flicker, the bulb reaching the end of its life, and the shadows it threw across the floor were long and angular, crossing over the unpaid insurance notice she'd set on the coffee table earlier in the week. Her hands were not shaking. She noticed this with a distant, clinical interest. She was not crying. She was sitting in the wreckage of something that had been quietly constructed over decades, and what she felt was not the sharp shock of a sudden blow. It was the settling weight of a thing confirmed. She had always suspected. She had told herself she was paranoid. She had not been paranoid. She set the legal papers on the floor beside her. She pressed her back against the couch. She listened to the street lamp tick in its irregular dying rhythm, and the radiator knock twice, and the wind find its way through the gap under the door. I have nothing left to give, she said, and her voice, in the quiet of the apartment, sounded very small and very clear. She sat there for a long time. Then she got up. She went to the kitchen. She drank a full glass of water, standing at the sink, looking at the reflection the window made of the kitchen light. She looked at herself looking back. She set the glass down. I have nothing left to give. That was true. She'd understood that for a long time, even when she hadn't had the language for it. What she had not yet understood, what she was beginning, in this moment, in this kitchen, to understand, was that there was a difference between having nothing left to give and having nothing left at all. She was an accountant. She knew the difference between an empty column and a balanced ledger. She turned off the kitchen light and went to bed, and she did not cry, and she did not sleep for a long time. And she lay in the dark and she thought about numbers. She was very good with numbers. Friends, what a journey we've been on with Claire. At 27 years old, she built something from nothing, a home, a career, a life that was entirely her own. And just when she finally felt the ground beneath her feet, the people who were supposed to protect her tried to take it all away. The lawsuit, the frozen account, the apartment that no longer felt like hers. Everything she worked for 11 years of overtime and sacrifice and careful, deliberate savings suddenly under threat. But here's what Arthur and Diane Miller don't know yet. They sued an accountant, a woman who has kept every receipt since she was 16 years old. A woman who knows exactly what a paper trail looks like and exactly how to build one. The second half of Claire's story is just getting started. And I promise you what's waiting in that storage unit at 2 in the morning is going to change everything. Stay with us, friends. The best part is still to come. She didn't sleep. Not really. She moved in and out of something that resembled sleep the way a photocopy resembles an original. The shape was right, but the substance wasn't there. At 3:15 she gave up entirely, lay on her back in the dark. And let her mind do what her mind had always been best at when left uninterrupted. It made lists. The things she knew for certain. The things she could prove. The things that existed in documented form and the things that existed only as memory, which was not nothing but was not enough. She thought about a conversation she had not thought about in years. She was 16. It was a Tuesday night in February. She was almost certain of it, because the radiator in the house on Hamlin had been running all day. And the windows were fogged with condensation and the smell of the kitchen, the specific smell of the house in winter. Something between old carpet and reheated coffee was very present in her memory now, summoned intact by the particular quality of the darkness and the cold. She had worked a closing shift at the diner on Pulaski. The kind of shift that ends at midnight. She'd cleaned the grease traps. She'd mopped the kitchen floor. She'd stripped her apron and her non-slip shoes at the back door and carried the smell of the fryer home on her hair and her clothes. And in the pores of her hands, which were red from the industrial degreaser. She came in through the back door and they were in the living room. Her parents. The television on. A young Sloane, 14 years old, sitting on the carpet with the expression of someone who has just received exactly what she wanted. An iPhone, the new kind, with the edge-to-edge screen in its white box. Still open, the cord and the documentation fanned out on the carpet around her like wrapping paper. The diner's closing tips had been $18 that night. Claire had tucked a 10 in her front pocket and given the rest to the register manager for the shared tip pool. She stood in the doorway for a moment, the smell of the kitchen still in her hair. Her father looked up. He had the expression of a man who was about to say something he had decided in advance to say, a speech he had prepared for precisely this occasion. "You're the strong one, Claire. You don't need us the way Sloane does. You never did. You're our investment in the future." She'd stood there with her red hands and her $18 in tips and her exhaustion that had its own specific weight, and she had nodded. And she had said something like "okay" or "I know" or "I understand," and she had gone upstairs to the room she shared with no one because Sloane had the larger room to herself. And she had sat on the edge of her bed and she had thought about the word investment. She had been 16. She had not yet understood what that word meant, used the way her father used it. She understood now. She got up. The apartment was dark. Sloane's door was closed, the light beneath it out. 2:40 in the morning. I wasn't being raised. I was being mined. She got dressed quietly. She took her keys off the hook. She had moved them to the hook by her bedroom door, a small adjustment. A small reassertion, and she went to the hallway closet and pulled out the folded piece of paper she'd taped to the back of the closet shelf 3 months ago. The storage unit number. The address of the facility on Western Avenue. She stood in the hallway and she listened to her sister's steady breathing behind the closed door and her own breathing in the silence and the radiator's patient, faithful rhythm. The pattern was always there. I just hadn't been ready to see it in full. She picked up her coat. "I will keep every receipt." She had said that once, in the reflection of a stainless steel diner surface, to a 16-year-old girl who was trying to find a way to survive a family that treated her labor as a natural resource. She had kept that promise to herself with a fidelity that had seemed, for years, merely habitual. It was not merely habitual. She locked the door behind her. The storage facility on Western Avenue was one of those places that exists at the intersection of practicality and forgetting. A 5-story concrete building with a keypad entrance, flickering corridor lights, and the specific, particular smell of sealed spaces, cardboard and dust and time. Claire had rented the unit 3 years ago when she moved out of the house on Hamlin. She'd paid 12 months in advance because the year rate was better than the monthly. And she'd renewed it twice since then on the same logic, and she had not been inside it since the second renewal. She was there at 2:17 in the morning. The corridor of Unit C was empty, the overhead fluorescence cycling between full brightness and a slightly dimmer setting in the rhythm of a building whose electrical system had its own priorities. Her footsteps were flat and clear on the concrete, and the sound they made was the only sound. Unit C 114. The padlock key was on her keyring, the small brass one. The one she'd always kept separate because she was deliberate about separating things by function. She opened it. She pulled the rolling door up, and it made the sound a rolling door makes a corrugated complaint, metal on metal. The unit was 7 by 10 feet. She'd stacked it well, 3 years ago. The boxes on the right side of the back wall were labeled in her handwriting, black marker on brown cardboard. Her labels: specific tax returns 2018 to 2021, bank statements 2016 to 2019, student loan docs, employment records, and at the back left, stacked under a folded moving blanket, a heavy plastic bin with a lid that had been sealed with 2 strips of packing tape. Dark gray, dusty, her handwriting on the side in the same black marker keep. She lifted the moving blanket. She pulled the bin forward on the concrete floor, broke the packing tape with her thumbnail, and opened it. 11 years. The documentation she had accumulated since she was 16 years old was not, it turned out, merely habitual record-keeping. It was the instinct of a person who had understood, at some cellular level, that the people around her were not interested in her version of events. And that the only version that would eventually survive was the one she could prove. She lifted the first folder. Pay stubs. Every pay period from her first diner job in February of her junior year of high school through her current position at Hartwell and Crane. Bound in elastic bands by year. Labeled. She set it aside and reached back in. Student loan origination documents. The original contract, the disbursement records, the repayment schedule she'd begun executing the month after graduation. Her parents' name appeared nowhere on these documents, because her parents had contributed nothing to them. She reached in again. Bank statements. The complete history of every deposit and withdrawal from her first checking account opened with $60 at the age of 17 through the present. Every month, documented, printed, filed. She sat back on her heels and looked at what she'd assembled, and she felt something she hadn't expected to feel, not relief. Not yet, but a kind of cold precision. A settling into focus. The way a lens finds its distance and the blur resolves. She was still looking through the files when she found the checks. They were near the bottom of the bin, in a folder she'd labeled Housing HH, which stood for Hamlin House. Which was what she'd called the house on Hamlin in her own private records. She opened it. 13 checks, made out to Arthur and Diane Miller. Written on her personal account. For rent. For the 2 years she'd lived at home during her first 2 years of community college before transferring, working full-time. Paying her own way through the remaining coursework at night. Her parents had accepted these checks. Cashed every one of them. She had the carbon copies. She sat on the floor of the storage unit at 2:40 in the morning. With 13 carbon copies of checks in her lap, and the arithmetic of it settled over her with the weight of something that has been true for a long time and has only now been stated aloud. They didn't invest in me. I invested in their survival. She said it quietly, in the empty corridor. Not to anyone, to the documented record of her own life. She packed the bin carefully. She took what she needed: 3 folders, the check carbons, the loan origination docs, the employment record file, and she carried them to her car. She drove home. She made coffee. She sat at her kitchen table. At 8:15 in the morning, she called the number she'd looked up on her phone the night before. Thorne Law. How can I direct your call? I'd like to schedule a consultation with Mr. Thorne, Claire said. I have a financial exploitation case. I have 11 years of documentation. A pause. How is Thursday at 2? I'll be there, Claire said. She clicked her pen. The click had a finality to it, the sound of a person who has decided the next move, who has run the numbers, who knows where every variable lies. Marcus Thorne was 52 years old, a defense attorney who specialized in financial, elder, and familial abuse cases. And he had the professional manner of a man who had heard a great many things and been surprised by very few of them. He met her in a conference room on Thursday afternoon, and he did not offer pleasantries beyond the handshake and the offer of water, which Claire accepted. She laid the documentation on the table in organized stacks. She presented it in chronological order. She walked him through the arithmetic with the calm, methodical pace of someone presenting a reconciliation to an audit committee. Because that was, at its core, exactly what this was. A reconciliation. A full accounting. When she finished, Thorne sat back in his chair. He looked at the stacks. He looked at the check carbons. He looked at the employment history running unbroken from her 16th year to the present. They sued an accountant, he said. Yes, Claire said. Who kept everything? Yes. He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. Let's file a counterclaim, he said. And a motion to dismiss their suit for lack of legal merit. I can have the papers ready by Monday. She drove home through the last of the November traffic. The city lights beginning to organize themselves against the early dark, and she thought about the word audit. I am an accountant. I know how to find the missing variables. Let's see how their investment holds up under a full audit. The printer ran late that night, the hum of it filling the small apartment. The paper emerging in steady, patient sheets, the truth, rendered in black and white, in 12-point font, in the language of evidence. Courtroom 402 was on the 4th floor of the Daily Center. And it had the quality of all institutional rooms that have witnessed a great many consequential events without being altered by any of them: the same pale walls, the same wooden railings worn smooth by generations of anxious hands, the same smell of industrial cleaner and old paper. The fluorescents ran at the same flat brightness regardless of what was being decided beneath them. Claire arrived at 8:45 and sat at the respondent's table with Marcus Thorne to her left and her documentation binders stacked in order to her right. She had organized the binders herself, color-coded by category, tabbed by date. Old habit. She could not sit at a table with disorganized materials. Her parents entered 10 minutes later, with their attorney. A man named Gould who had the harried, slightly apologetic energy of a lawyer who had taken a contingency case that was performing less well than projected. Arthur was wearing the gray suit he reserved for occasions he considered important. He looked across the room at Claire once, with the expression of a man who believes that confidence is itself a form of argument. Claire looked back at him without expression and returned her attention to her notes. Judge Mariela Castillo entered at 9 on the mark. She was in her early 60s, with silver hair cut short and reading glasses on a chain. And the bearing of a person who had been allocated a finite quantity of patience and was disinclined to waste it. She surveyed the courtroom once, took her seat, and opened the case file. Plaintiffs are claiming parental investment reimbursement, she said, reading from the filing with the flat neutrality of someone reading a grocery list. She looked up over her glasses. I've read this 3 times. I want to be very clear with the plaintiff's counsel that this is not a recognized cause of action in the state of Illinois. Gould stood. He had prepared for this. He delivered the argument his clients had presumably paid him to deliver, the theory of implicit financial contribution, the calculus of parental sacrifice. The emotional and material investment of 18 years of child rearing. Judge Castillo listened with the expression of a woman who has scheduled 12 minutes for this argument and is prepared to use only 8. When he concluded, she turned to Thorne. Thorne stood and placed 5 documents on the table in front of him. Your Honor, I'll be brief. He picked up the first document. This is the complete mortgage record for Ms. Miller's condominium. Her name and hers alone appears on the deed. The down payment $18,000 was sourced entirely from her personal savings, documented here. He placed the second document. This is her 11-year employment history, beginning at age 16. Unbroken, self-funded, including 2 years of concurrent community college tuition paid by Ms. Miller herself, with no parental contribution documented here. Third document. And these, he held up the thin folder containing the 13 carbon copies. These are canceled checks written by my client to the plaintiffs during the 2 years she lived in their home as an adult student. Checks for rent, totaling $4,800, cashed in full. The courtroom was quiet. The plaintiffs did not invest in the respondent, Thorne said, setting the folder down. The respondent invested in the plaintiffs. The record reflects this without ambiguity. Judge Castillo looked at the documents for a long moment. Then she looked at Arthur and Diane Miller, and the look she gave them was not the neutral, institutional look of a jurist evaluating a legal theory. It was the look of a person who has seen something she finds specifically, personally objectionable. Arthur was already composing himself for a response. She could see it in his posture, the slight forward lean, the readiness to speak. Gould put a hand on his arm. Mr. Gould, the judge said, without looking away from the plaintiff's table, does your client have anything further to add to the record? Your Honor, Mr. Miller would like to speak to the emotional labor of parenting, she said. Her voice had not changed in volume or pitch. It had changed in a different way. I've been on this bench for 16 years, Mr. Gould. I've seen financial exploitation cases from every direction. I know what this is. She looked down at the case file. Case dismissed with prejudice. She set the file aside. The counterclaim is accepted. Costs are awarded to the respondent. She paused, and the courtroom was so still that the ventilation hum from the ceiling was audible. And I'll add this, off the record I strongly suggest the plaintiffs redirect their energies toward gainful employment rather than litigation. She closed the file. Today, the court wrote in ink what my heart had been shouting in silence for 11 years. Claire sat very still for a moment. The courtroom around her was processing. Gould leaning toward his clients with the low, rapid murmur of professional damage control. Thorne gathering his documents with the unhurried efficiency of a man whose afternoon has gone as anticipated, the court reporter's fingers stilling on the keys. The courtroom air was thin, institutional. Completely without sentiment. She breathed it in. It was the first time in weeks I could actually breathe. She collected her binders. She straightened the stack, aligned the spines, clipped her pen to the cover of the top folder. She picked them up. She stood. Her parents were at the plaintiff's table, and her father was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, not anger, not contempt. Something thinner. Something that had the shape of a man who has placed a calculated bet and watched the math fail him publicly. Claire looked at him. She had prepared something, in the weeks leading to this day. Not a speech. Not a confrontation. Just a single sentence she had turned over in her mind like a stone, feeling its weight, deciding whether to use it. She didn't use it. She walked past her parents without stopping, her legal victory tucked firmly under her arm, the binders, the documentation. The evidence, the 11-year record of her own life. She did not look back. Thorne caught up with her at the elevator. Counterclaim will take about 6 weeks to settle, he said. I'll be in touch. Thank you, Marcus. The elevator arrived. She stepped in. The doors closed, and for a moment she was alone in the small mirrored box of the elevator, and she looked at herself, her coat, her binders, her face. Which was calm in a way that felt different from the careful, maintained calm of the past several weeks. Different from suppression. Different from control. It felt, she thought, like the end of a very long calculation. Like the moment when you find the error in the ledger and the columns finally balance. The elevator opened on the lobby. She walked out into the December air, which was cold and clear and indifferent, and she turned her face toward it. She asked Sloane to be out by Friday. She didn't say it unkindly. She said it the way you say the true thing when you've finally stopped protecting everyone else from its truth. Directly, without cushioning, without apology, but also without cruelty. Sloane, to her credit, did not argue. She packed her 4 suitcases and her 2 rolling duffels and her garment bag. And she left on Thursday evening, and the sound the door made when it closed behind her was the sound of a room returning to itself. Claire stood in the office doorway for a moment. The filing cabinet was back where it belonged. Sloane had moved it 3 feet to the left, and Claire had moved it back the day after the hearing, and now it stood in its correct position against the north wall. And the desk was uncluttered, and the window that faced the back alley let in the gray December light at the same angle it always had. She vacuumed. She mopped. She opened the window for 20 minutes despite the cold because she wanted the air to move through the space. And she wanted the space to smell like December and not like sweet synthetic perfume. She replaced the air diffuser in the hallway. She rehung the small print above the coffee station, which Sloane had removed and left leaning against the baseboard. Then she sat at her kitchen table with her laptop and her legal pad. And her mug, the world's okayest fisherman mug, and she began the work of rebuilding what the past several weeks had disrupted. The account freeze had been lifted within 48 hours of the dismissal. The homeowner's insurance had been paid. The automatic transfers to her retirement account were rescheduled. She had emailed her managing partner, David Hartwell, a brief, factual summary of the legal matter and its resolution, and he had replied within the hour with "Understood. Good to have it behind you. See you Thursday for your review." Which was, coming from David Hartwell, essentially an embrace. The restraining order application took 2 hours. She completed it with the same careful thoroughness she brought to any document that mattered, and she signed it, and she set it in the manila folder next to her mortgage deed. And she put it in the second drawer of the kitchen desk. The retirement fund autopay setup took 15 minutes. When she was done, she made a fresh espresso and took it out onto the balcony. The December air was very cold. Lake Michigan was invisible from here, the city was in the way, but you could feel it. The particular weight of air that has traveled across that much open water carries something in it that the city cannot entirely absorb, and on clear nights in December, you could step onto a balcony in Logan Square and feel the lake in the temperature and the particular quality of the silence between traffic sounds. She wrapped both hands around the mug. The espresso steamed. 700 square feet. 1 bedroom. A second room that belongs to me again. A filing cabinet with 11 years of documentation. A mortgage in my name. A retirement account that is mine, entirely, with no one's hands on it. She was 27 years old. She thought about the 16-year-old who had tucked a $20 bill into a pill organizer on a Tuesday night in February, her hands red from industrial degreaser. Her parents laughing in the living room over a new iPhone for a sister who hadn't worked a day. She thought about that girl with the specific tenderness that you bring to the memory of someone who survived something they shouldn't have had to survive alone. I see you, she thought. You kept every receipt. You didn't let them tell you what you were worth. You were right to keep going. Across the Chicago skyline, the lights arranged themselves as they always did. The specific, non-negotiable geometry of a city that has its own pace and its own indifference and its own extraordinary, impersonal beauty. She had looked at this view from this balcony on good nights and difficult nights, and on the night after she signed the mortgage. And on the night after she read the summons, and the view had not changed. The city did not adjust itself for individual reckonings. She found that comforting. At 27, I finally learned that starting over isn't failure. It's freedom. She had built this life once. She could build it again more clearly this time, with better visibility of who belonged in it and who had used it as a vehicle for their own interests. She could build it without guilt and without the inherited obligation to subsidize other people's choices with her labor. She finished her coffee. She went inside. She locked the balcony door. And then she locked the front door. She had locked this door hundreds of times. The bolt was a Schlage B60N, which she had installed herself, replacing the original builder-grade lock that came with the unit, because she'd read that the original was a standard pin tumbler that could be shimmed in under 30 seconds, and she was not interested in a 30-second entry point. The Schlage had a satisfying, definitive action, a firm quarter turn, and the bolt extended fully, the mechanism seating cleanly into the strike plate with a sound that was solid and final and complete. She listened to it. For the first time in months, the sound of the bolt clicking home was the sound of peace. She turned off the hallway light. She stood in the dark of her apartment, her floor, her furniture, her walls in the color she had chosen, and she listened to the radiator knock twice in the corner, which meant it was waking up. Which meant the temperature outside was dropping, which meant winter was settling in for its long Chicago residency. She was warm. She went to bed. Friends, how did you find today's story? Claire Miller at 27, a junior accountant with red hands and a pill organizer full of crumpled bills. And the 11-year paper trail that saved everything she'd built. I've thought about her story a great deal, and what stays with me most is not the courtroom. It's not the moment the judge dismissed the case. It's the storage unit at 2 in the morning. Because that's the real story, isn't it? The quiet, unglamorous faithfulness. The young woman who told herself, I will keep every receipt, not because she knew she'd need them someday in a courtroom, but because she understood, at the deepest level, that her version of the truth deserved to be documented. That her labor deserved to be counted. There's a lesson here that goes beyond finances and legal filings. It's this: the people who try to diminish you depend on your silence. They depend on the fact that you won't write it down, won't keep the copies, won't be able to prove what you know to be true. Claire did everything they assumed she wouldn't. She was meticulous. She was patient. She was methodical in the way that only a person who has been quietly wronged for a very long time can be methodical, with a calm, steady, unhurried precision. And at the end of it, she didn't give a speech. She didn't have a final confrontation. She simply walked past them with her binders under her arm and got in the elevator, and let the doors close, and breathed. That, friends, is what winning actually looks like. Not loud, not theatrical, just the quiet, irreversible sound of a bolt sliding home. If you're carrying something like Claire's story, if you've been told that your hard work was someone else's investment, that your needs were less important, that love and exploitation are the same transaction, I hope today's story found you. I hope this story brought you something you needed. If it did, please subscribe and hit that like button. It helps us keep telling stories that matter, for the people who need to hear them most. We'll see you next time, friends. Take care of yourselves.